this is heartbreaking. So, this is 17-year-old Lisa Home. One quiet summer evening, she just vanished from a cafe in Bloomberg, Sweden. And what happened next? Honestly, it turned into one of the biggest search operations in the country's history. Hundreds of volunteers, helicopters, police, all combing the area, hoping, praying to find her alive. But, as hours stretched into days, and some really unsettling clues started popping up, the authorities got seriously worried, and, oh man, after 5 days of searching, they finally got their answer. Deep inside a building near a farm, investigators found what they called a milking room. And I'm not even kidding, this place was so creepy and disgusting that a lot of the officers needed therapy afterward. So, what really happened to Lisa Home? What exactly was this milking room, and who could be responsible for such horrifying cruelty? Even just saying the words milking room makes me shiver. Hey friends, welcome back to my detective channel, Michael. Okay, so today's story, oh my god, it's definitely not for the faint of heart. I'm serious while putting this together. I got chills down my spine more than a few times. So, if you're still ready to dive in, first thing, drop a comment telling me which city you're watching from and what time it is there. Alright, now let's get started. It was a calm Sunday evening in June of 2015, and the little Swedish village of Bloomberg was just doing its usual thing, quiet, cozy, picturesque. Bloomberg is small, but it's got this really charming vibe. If you're a tourist, you'd love it for the chill atmosphere, the gorgeous nature, and those cute streets lined with tiny cafes and shops. You can stroll along the waterfront, take in views of the lake or river, and check out the local cultural and historical spots. And hey, if you're into being active, the areas around Bloomberg have some awesome trails for hiking and biking. Honestly, it's perfect if you need a break from the noise of a big city and want to soak in the real peace of the Swedish countryside. But, unfortunately, for all the wrong reasons, you're going to get a closer look at this area as we move deeper into today's video. So, on June 7th, 2015, 17-year-old Lisa Home was wrapping up her shift at a little countryside cafe near the foot of Kinnakulla, a beautiful hill nestled between two lakes. Lisa was known for being smart, responsible, and way more mature than most people her age. Honestly, her parents trusted her completely. They were totally fine with her working at the cafe and even letting her head home on her own. She had only started working there a few weeks earlier. Usually, her parents would drive her back and forth on weekends. But that day was special. She was finally going home by herself on her new moped. It was around 6:23 in the evening, right as the sun was dipping behind the hills, when Lisa texted her dad. She said she was almost done closing up and would be heading home soon. Normally, the ride took about half an hour, and she'd done it countless times before. Even though most of her trips had been with her parents, she knew the route like the back of her hand. The road wove between forests and fields and was considered super safe. Honestly, the only real threat out there would have been like some Swedish meatball rolling down the hill. But that evening, everything changed. Lisa never made it home. Minutes turned into hours, and worry turned into full-on terror. By 8 o'clock, her dad just couldn't wait any longer. He jumped in the car and drove toward the cafe, scanning the empty roads, desperate for any sign of her. When he got there, at first, he felt a little relief, but it didn't last. His heart sank again the second he saw her moped parked neatly right outside the cafe. He checked it, and the keys were still dangling in the ignition. Her bag was just there next to it. Even worse, the helmet was gone, and the cafe where she worked was dark, quiet, and empty. He called out her name, over and over, but there was no answer. All that could be heard was the wind and the creak of old trees, and Lisa, she was gone. Panicked and desperate, her dad called the police at 9:47 in the evening. Within hours, a massive search kicked off. Neighbors, friends, and local volunteers flooded the area, trying to find her. Flashlights swept over the open fields, barns nearby were checked thoroughly, roads were blocked, and everyone knew Lisa had disappeared. But despite all the people, the first sweep turned up almost nothing. No signs of a struggle, no clues, no footprints, absolutely nothing. And as Lisa remained missing, the investigators started to get seriously worried. Alright, so here's where things start to get chilling. That's when they stumbled onto the first real clue. Inside an old barn across the street from the cafe, the police dogs picked up Lisa's scent. The barn itself was basically abandoned, nobody had worked there for ages. It was mostly just used to store some old furniture, and otherwise, it was just left to rot. When the officers stepped inside, they noticed the mess. Old equipment, piles of firewood, dust covering every floorboard. But hidden in all that grime, they found something important, a single black glove. Later, it was confirmed that it belonged to Lisa. By midnight, things were heating up. In just a few hours, the search had become one of the largest operations the region had ever seen. More police kept arriving, and locals refused to sleep. Even people who barely knew Lisa joined the search because, honestly, stuff like this just didn't happen in Bloomberg. By sunrise, this quiet little village had completely transformed. Temporary command posts were set up, maps were covered in notes, radios buzzed non-stop, and the tight-knit community, always so united, was in total shock. Their safe little town had lost a 17-year-old girl, and as the sun rose over the fields of Bloomberg, it became clear that the fear and uncertainty that gripped the village that night were only going to grow. Now, with so many details of the case, I'm going to walk you step by step through everything that happened next. But before we dive into what unfolded, we need to understand where this all happened, and, more importantly, who Lisa was. Lisa Holm grew up in Skive, a quiet town in western Sweden. By the time she turned 17, she'd already earned a reputation as responsible, warm, and mature beyond her years. In the summer of 2015, she finally got her first job, and working shifts at the cafe was her first real taste of work life. To make getting to and from work easier, her parents had gifted her a moped. Her parents believed in teaching the right values. Work hard, earn your reward. Meanwhile, her friends described her as a glad girl. That doesn't really translate perfectly, but basically, she was the kind of person who asked questions with genuine curiosity and always had this upbeat, joyful energy. She loved pop music, especially One Direction, which, honestly, might have been the only crime she ever committed. Lisa was balanced, polite, responsible, and always a bright presence. And on the day she disappeared, she was exactly that. Alright, so the people who worked with her that day said she was polite, curious, in a good mood basically, acting just like Lisa always did. But now, she was gone. Let's start with a map. As you can see, Lisa had quite a distance to cover to get home, about 45 miles between her and her family. But here's the thing, since her moped was still parked at the cafe, it looks like whatever happened before she even got on the road. By Monday morning, the search kicked into overdrive. Police, the military, and hundreds of volunteers combed the area on foot, horseback, and ATVs. Fields, ditches, forests, barns, they checked everything in widening circles, moving outward from the cafe. I've got a few maps here to show you, but the initial search radius was just 300 meters. That small area meant they could check every single square meter really carefully, nothing could be missed. Spoiler alert, they did miss something. And, of course, in the days that followed, the radius kept growing from 300 meters to 6 miles or more, and as the area expands, the attention on each square meter naturally drops. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. By June 10th, the organization Missing People joined the hunt, bringing dozens of trained volunteers and specialized equipment, and just 2 days later, the first real leads started showing up. About a kilometer from the cafe, along a dirt road, searchers found scattered items, a pink phone case, and parts of a mobile phone. Later, these were confirmed to belong to Lisa.
Polisen utökar sökområdet till att omfatta en diameter på 10 kilometer om man gör fler fynd. Missing People fortsätter att hjälpa polisen i sökandet under hela dagen.
A little further down that same dirt road, searchers found a torn receipt and a train ticket with Lisa's name clearly printed on it. The next day, even more clues started popping up. One of Lisa's dad's friends was driving past the cafe when he noticed that the police tape around the barn nearby was gone. Just to be clear, that's the same barn across from the cafe where they had found her glove. So, when the building was no longer cordoned off, the neighbor decided to peek inside, and there, on the dusty floor, he spotted a pair of pearl earrings glinting in the light. He immediately knew they belonged to Lisa. Soon after, her parents confirmed it. The next morning, along the road heading south, they also found Lisa's ID. and her house keys. The evidence seemed completely scattered, chaotic, like someone was deliberately trying to confuse her trail. By June 11th, the 4th day after Lisa's disappearance, the search area had expanded again, now covering all the nearby farms and estates. And believe me, things were about to get way worse, like seriously bad. One of those farms was the Myotorp farm, about a mile from the cafe. It was small, noticeably old, and pretty run down. At that time, 3 migrants from the Baltic states were living there. Interestingly, even though they had moved to Sweden a few years earlier, none of them had learned Swedish. They only spoke Lithuanian and English. Otherwise, they seemed like completely normal people. On June 12th, volunteers started combing the area around the farm, and something strange happened. 2 of the migrants, a man and a woman, approached them. They claimed that the police had already searched the area, and that the volunteers were basically wasting their time. But here's the thing, their insistence didn't just feel off. It came across as suspiciously defensive. Especially the man. Everyone could sense he was seriously tense. He wasn't just urging the volunteers to leave quickly, he even warned that he would call the police if they didn't go. Luckily, the volunteers didn't back down. They politely asked the man to step aside and kept searching the property. They couldn't explain why, but something about that place gave them this deep, uneasy feeling. And at that moment, none of them had any idea that just a few hours later, they were about to stumble onto a horrifying discovery that would basically end the search. Ironically, if the man was trying to distract people from the farm, his anxious and aggressive behavior had the opposite effect. He freaked out the volunteers so much that they decided to call the police. Within minutes, officers arrived on the scene, and given how suspicious the farm residents were acting, the police were ready to comb every single inch of the property. As for the farm itself, it was pretty large and spread out. First, there was the main house, where all 3 migrants lived. Nearby were 2 old barns, mostly used for storing equipment. There were wooded areas on the property, and deeper in, a few small outbuildings lined a country road. You can really get the layout from this aerial shot. The area was massive, and there were tons of places where anything or even a body could be hidden. What had seemed ordinary before now felt soaked in tension. And as the officers made their way toward the Myotorp farm, they realized that most of the items already found from Lisa's belongings were actually along the path leading to this property. After putting together some research, I was able to map out exactly where her items had been found, and as you can see, they clearly pointed in the direction she had been moving. The fact that this farm was so close to the cafe, close enough that both could be seen in a single drone shot, was deeply unsettling. As night fell, police spread out across the property, searching the ground with flashlights, trying to find any kind of evidence. And sadly, it was there, in the tall grass near one of the barns, that the searchers finally made their breakthrough. Hidden among the weeds and branches lay a dark jacket, later confirmed to be Lisa's. Underneath it, they found her white moped helmet, the one that had gone missing the night she disappeared. After this discovery, all efforts focused on this area. The property was immediately cordoned off, and officers began meticulously searching the house, barns, and outbuildings every single square meter. In less than half an hour, several serious points of interest emerged. But before we move forward, let's start with one of the outbuildings. Detectives noticed a small white shed deeper on the property. The grass in front of it was flattened, like someone had been going back and forth frequently. It was strange because the shed itself looked completely unused, but the trampled grass suggested otherwise. The police forced the door open and stepped inside, and immediately they were hit with a sharp, unmistakable smell of death. The shed had 2 small rooms, a bedroom and a changing area, and the smell was coming from one of the metal lockers. Officers started opening them, one by one, and tragically, they finally found what they had been searching for all this time. Inside the narrow locker was Lisa's lifeless body. She was partially undressed, with her mouth sealed with grey tape. Around her neck, officers saw a rope tied in a knot. The discovery was devastating. After nearly a week of relentless searching, it ended with the worst possible outcome. By nightfall, the Myotorp farm was swarming with detectives in white protective suits, carefully examining every corner. They collected fibers, fingerprints, shoe prints, and countless other pieces of evidence. We'll get back to those details later, but one thing is clear, the police didn't leave this scene empty-handed. The news of the discovery spread incredibly fast, and when the volunteers, who had spent days tirelessly searching for Lisa, found out, they just broke down. From what I've seen and heard, Even the most experienced officers stood silently, stunned, tears in their eyes. And literally overnight, the village of Bloomberg transformed into a place of pure horror. And, of course, as soon as Lisa's body was found, pretty much everyone immediately focused their attention and suspicions on the people living at the farm. And I've got to say, one man really stood out. This was the same guy who had tried to brush off the volunteers. His name was Narius Bolovicius, a 35-year-old migrant from Lithuania. Not surprisingly, he lived on that farm with his wife and younger brother. The next morning, all three were arrested for questioning. At first glance, Narius seemed like a guy you'd easily forget. Quiet, stocky, kept to himself. He had moved to Sweden a few years earlier, supposedly in search of honest work and a better life. He settled in quickly, living on the Myotorp farm with his wife, Irina, and his younger brother. When you talked to him, he was polite, but he never really became part of the local community, and it's easy to see why he hadn't even tried to learn Swedish. But, unfortunately for Narius, when the police searched his room, they found a true monster. His computer was filled with violent pornography, and his search history painted a picture of obsession, control, and sexual aggression. Things were already looking extremely bad for him. But when it came to a connection with Lisa's murder, well, he practically handed it to them himself. And I mean, he made it ridiculously easy, though these details are definitely not for the faint of heart. We'll get back to all that later, but for now, here's the short version. His DNA was found on both sides of Lisa's body. Traces of his DNA were also found on her clothing. Remember, Lisa was found partially undressed, with tape on her body, and although the autopsy confirmed there had been no sexual assault, everything else at the scene strongly suggested a sexual motive. Neighbours of Narius also came forward with damning details. Some of them saw his car parked near the cafe the night Lisa disappeared. And this wasn't just a casual drive-by, he was standing there, watching. On top of that, a security camera at a nearby gas station caught him later that evening, most likely after everything had been done. From a psychological perspective, Narius was a classic monster hiding in plain sight. On the surface, he looked like a family man, a husband, living an ordinary life. But inside, he was a predator, just waiting for the right moment. By the time the police finally sat him down in the interrogation room, they already knew he was the killer. At that point, Narius was completely trapped. DNA evidence, eyewitness accounts, even his own arrogance were all working against him. But despite the mountain of evidence, he denied everything.
Prašau, papasakok, ką tu galvoji?
Neturiu aš jums ką be papasakot.
Jag har inget mer.
Ką aš jums nesakau, vis tiek jūs manim nieko netikit.
Oavsett vad jag säger, ni tror inte på mig.
From the moment officers discovered Lisa's body, they proceeded with extreme caution, trying to figure out exactly what had happened to her. And little by little, detail by detail, every piece of evidence started pointing straight at Narius. I mean, the DNA alone was telling a story that no lie could ever cover up. And you know, almost every story I cover has at least one shocking detail that just sticks out. Like last week, all eyes were on Scotty College and his mental state. This week, it's all about the crime scene itself. So let's talk about each area the investigators examined together. They paint a truly chilling picture. First, detectives wanted to figure out what had happened to Lisa, and in one of the farm's barns, they, unfortunately, found their answer. One room in that barn, previously used for storing cow's milk, was coated in dust and dirt. The entire place looked disgusting, almost like something out of a horror movie. But while they were there, they noticed one pipe that was suspiciously clean, no dust or debris. A closer look revealed pieces of rope both on the pipe and on the floor beneath it. After analysing and comparing the evidence, investigators determined that the rope found around Lisa's neck was the same type as the rope from this room, which by then they had started calling the milk room. From this, detectives were able to confirm that, tragically, Lisa had been strangled right there in the milk room, and sadly, that wasn't the end of it. In fact, it was just the beginning. They also found traces of Narius on the property and on Lisa's clothing. When they compared it to Narius's DNA, it was a perfect match, undeniable. To make the whole situation even more absurd, his explanation was straight out of a crazy person's handbook. Narius claimed he had just relieved himself in the barn on a different day. And honestly, that's terrifying in itself. Why the heck would anyone even do that in a place like that? His genetic traces were literally everywhere. On the rope used to strangle Lisa, on her clothing, on both the inside and outside of her belongings and all over the barn. They even found his blood on Lisa's jacket, which clearly showed she had fought back. And believe me, it gets worse. Just outside the door of the milk room, they found a huge pile of human feces. Analysis later confirmed it belonged to Nereus. The police concluded that after murdering Lisa, Nereus was so worked up by what he'd done that he literally lost control right there. Honestly, this has to be one of the most disgusting moments in human history. Just imagine it's not enough that you just killed someone, but in the very same moment, you completely lose control of yourself. And that's still not all. Back at the cafe, just a mile away, officers discovered that Nereus had been regularly sneaking into the barn across the road, and when they inspected it more closely, they found yet another horrifying detail. Police realized that from a small room inside the barn, there was a direct line of sight to the cafe. When they scanned the walls under ultraviolet light, what they saw was deeply disturbing. There were stains scattered all over the walls. Lab tests confirmed everyone's worst fears. Nereus's DNA was in those stains. It appeared he had been using that window and vantage point to secretly watch Lisa and other women satisfying himself in secret. At this point, it's honestly hard to even find words. Nereus was one of the most vile people I've ever had to report on. As I mentioned before, Lisa's personal items, her phone case, keys, jacket, and helmet, formed a clear trail that led straight to the Emtorp farm where Nereus lived. When asked where he had been between 6:30 and 7:30 that evening, the time Lisa disappeared, Nereus claimed he was either in his bedroom, sleeping, or talking on the phone with his mother. But when police checked his phone records, the timing didn't match at all. His call took place after Lisa had already gone missing, and multiple witnesses saw his car circling near the cafe around 7 o'clock. Moreover, his own behavior raised serious suspicions. Nereus's attempt to brush off the volunteers and steer them away from the property only intensified the scrutiny. Honestly, I think he would have been caught quickly anyway, but he certainly made the police's job easier. By this point, the evidence against him was overwhelming. He was a man surrounded by his own rope, duct tape, feces, blood, and lies. You might think that faced with such a mountain of proof, he would finally confess. But no, Nereus stubbornly insisted he was innocent and had been set up. Now, let's move on to the trial, because he certainly did not make it easy. The trial of Nereus began in the fall of 2015, and from day one, it was clear it would be one of Sweden's most high-profile criminal cases. Journalists described the atmosphere in the courtroom as suffocating, and Lisa's parents had to sit just a few meters away from Nereus. When he was brought into the courtroom, heavily guarded and wearing prison clothing, the room fell silent. Even then, he avoided any eye contact with Lisa's family, his expression remaining unreadable. He barely reacted to anything said during the trial, which made him seem even colder and more detached. For many people, this was the first time they fully grasped what had happened that evening. The timeline went roughly like this. Around 6:23 p.m., Lisa was closing the cafe with 2 colleagues. She sent a message to her father saying she would soon be on her way home. After closing, the 2 colleagues left for the bus at the front, while Lisa headed to a moped parked in the back. That's why her colleagues noticed nothing. And within just a few minutes, Nereus intercepted her. Evidence shows that Nereus, who had been lurking near the cafe for some time, watched Lisa finish work. When she was ready to leave, he lightly stopped her and asked her to show him the way to the nearest town. We know this because he had attempted the same tactic with another woman just weeks earlier. When he asked that woman to get into his car, she became frightened and left. Nereus probably claimed he didn't understand Swedish and asked Lisa to enter the directions into his car's Jeep, and it was likely at that moment, once she was inside the car, that he rendered her unconscious. Investigators believe he overpowered Lisa, abducted her, and then forced her into one of the auxiliary buildings on the Emtorp farm, most likely the infamous milk room. If you want my creasier plays. Inside the room, a brutal struggle unfolded. Lisa fought desperately, leaving traces of Nereus's DNA under her fingernails, and later his blood was found on her jacket. Nereus ultimately overpowered her. Once he succeeded, he bound her with rope and duct tape, gagged her, and then attempted to sexually assault her. Forensic evidence confirms that Lisa was strangled with that same rope inside the milk room. A small clarification: many articles and crime channels get this detail wrong. They often claim she was killed in the shed near the cafe, but we know the truth. It was the shed on the Emtorp farm. After the murder, Nereus panicked soiled himself, and then sexually gratified himself near Lisa's body. He then placed her in a locker inside the shed and scattered her belongings along the road to mislead investigators. Given all this, it's clear how the trial would proceed. But before moving on to the verdict, let's take a moment to look at his defense. His lawyers claimed that Narius had been framed. They even suggested, absurdly, that his wife or younger brother might have been involved. Complete nonsense, considering that after a brief detention, both were fully exonerated. The brother even admitted that Narius had begged him to create an alibi, claiming that if he didn't, the poor immigrant would likely be accused of a crime he never committed. On the 17th of November 2015, the jury finally delivered the verdict. Narius was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison. Unfortunately, his story didn't end there. In fact, things got worse before they got better. Sweden's prison system is not particularly harsh. If you look at some photos, it almost resembles a hotel. And yes, that's exactly where Narius was held. It's reported that housing prisoners like Narius costs taxpayers roughly $500 per day, which is just absurd. But it got even stranger. In early 2017, Narius applied to transfer to Lithuania to serve the remainder of his life sentence, a move that initially made little sense, given that prisons in Lithuania are much harsher than in Sweden. But the reason soon became clear. After his successful transfer to Lithuania, he filed for a sentence reduction under Lithuanian law, and astonishingly, he won. So, Narius ended up with a new sentence, just 15 years for killing Lisa Holm. But the story didn't stop there. Later, his sentence was reinstated to life imprisonment, and after months of abuse by other inmates in Lithuania, he was eventually killed in his cell. It turns out, he was constantly harassed by other prisoners, which kept him in continual conflict, and one day, one of them finished the job. Quite the twist, right? Honestly, I can't say I feel sorry for Narius, but my heart still aches for Lisa. Her murder was a national tragedy and sent shockwaves far beyond Blomberg. For those who don't know, Sweden is a country proud of its safety and sense of community. Suddenly, they were confronted with a horror they simply could not believe. Over 900 volunteers joined the search for Lisa. In the end, their hopes and efforts were shattered. Life in Blomberg would never be the same. Her parents became more cautious. The cafe turned into a place of mourning, and the village took a long time to restore its reputation. Yet from this tragedy came solidarity. During this nightmare, the organization Missing People gained national recognition and inspired thousands to become volunteers. It's no surprise that Lisa's funeral, held on the 7th of July 2015, was too large for the church. Over 130 people fit inside, while hundreds more stood outside listening through loudspeakers. Friends described her as a kind, creative girl, full of dreams, a girl who loved horses and baking, and who hoped one day to study architecture, possibly even in Australia. In her honor, a cherry blossom tree was planted near the cafe, and every spring its bloom reminds locals of Lisa. I think this is one of those stories that people never truly recover from. What happened to Lisa was utterly horrifying, and Blomberg will always carry that scar. Tragically, it was her first time traveling home alone. This is a story with the darkest details and the most horrifying coincidences. What do you think about this case? First, what do you think about Lisa going home alone? Second, what do you think about Narius's sentence, its subsequent review and reduction? That final twist was quite insane. Well, friends, that's all for today. Honestly, I just really appreciate you being here on YouTube. In the meantime, remember to take care of yourselves and each other. Stay safe, stay curious, and thank you. Goodbye.